now going to turn our attention to mobile source air pollution. That's a fancy way of saying vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, whatever. And this is different than stationary source, which was factories. How is it different? Well, with the factories, you have a few producers. They can't move very easily. You can pinpoint them and test them. With automobiles, you can have millions of automobiles traveling in and out of an area. It's hard to isolate them and say this particular automobile is producing this much air pollution, there's other ones producing a different amount, so we're going to fine them or have a Pigouvian tax on them. It's a very difficult situation to deal with. Let's think about how this is structured. You have few producers of cars, yet you have millions of consumers of the cars, and it's actually the consumers of the cars that are producing the pollution through their driving. Now, these vehicles are essential to business and essential to our lifestyles. So people don't really want to give up their cars, and that's very difficult. So what is the economic problems associated with automobiles? Well, it's a case of negative externalities. And those negative externalities are primarily the air pollution, but there's also the problem of traffic congestion, which is a negative externality on us, and also accidents. Another person hits us with their vehicle, that does damage to us. Their lack of care is another example of a negative externality. What we see is the air pollution from the other vehicles, which is affecting us when we're not in our car and even when we're in our car. And there's the air pollution that's occurring within our car, either from our own vehicle or from a vehicle, say, right in front of us in a traffic jam. Automobiles are also interesting because we know that there's all these problems, and yet we have subsidies, or at least implied subsidies. For example, the roads. When they first started paying, the roads, paving the roads and making them available for vehicles, they had a gasoline tax, and the gasoline tax paid entirely for the roads. So the nice paved roads were paid for by the gasoline tax. But today that's not true anymore. The gasoline tax only covers about 35 to 38% of the cost of the roads. Again, it's being subsidized through property taxes and sales taxes as well. Another problem, though, is parking is free. In most places, parking is free. Now, if you go into San Francisco or New York, parking is not free. It's very expensive, and so they don't have that subsidy. But here in Indiana, parking is free. If we go to the grocery store, there's plenty of parking. Now, I say parking is free, but is that actually true? Is the parking free? And technically the answer is no, because that meant that the mall or the shopping center had to buy more land than they actually needed, and they're having to maintain that parking lot. So how is that paid for? It's reflected in the price of the goods. This is why you're going to pay more if you go to a mall than if you order something online. The mall prices will usually be a lot more expensive. Even a strip mall would be less expensive than a big mall. We have this implied subsidy for something that we're concerned about, creating externalities. So what are the approaches that we could use here? One of those would be regulation. Now, where would you use regulation? Well, you could use it at the production of the automobile level. So you could regulate the production of the automobiles by requiring the producers of the automobiles, for example, to put catalytic converters on all of their cars. You could require them to meet certain mileage standards, which we refer to as CAFE standards. So yes, regulation is an approach we could use. And ideally, because of the monitoring and enforcement costs, you don't want to use regulation, if you can avoid it, on the end user. You'd like to do that on the producer because there's only a handful of them, so it's a lot less expensive to do. Now, you could also use regulation at the fuel production level. Again, few producers, you can monitor and enforce it much simpler if you go to that level. So what do? Well, one of the things we do is we require certain additives. Additives would include ethanol, removing the lead out of the process, oxygenation, and in California they experimented with something called MTBE. It's methyl tertiary butyl ether. And let me tell you a little bit about that. MTBE was added because they thought this would help retain oxygen in the gasoline, be better for mileage, and the gasoline would burn cleaner. Well, that was true, but it turns out that a lot of the MTBE wasn't consumed in the combustion process, and it ended up in the exhaust going into the atmosphere and damaging birds. So the birds' eggs were much thinner. The babies, the population of birds didn't survive as much, and it was damaging the bird population. So goodbye to MTBE because the birds were more important. The ethanol has its own whole slew of issues. Of course, with ethanol, we're using not food corn, but commercial corn. And I know that there's a lot of people in Indiana who grow this kind of corn, similar to feed corn for animals. And this corn then is used to produce ethanol, which is then added to the gasoline, mixed with the gasoline. What's the impact of this? Well, that means more land, farmland, is being used to produce that corn. That means that farmland can't be used to produce feed corn or food corn. That means food prices and feed prices of corn are going to rise. And that means that people around the world are going to have to pay higher prices. That's going to create more starvation and difficulties for poor people. There's a trade-off there that we have to think about. All right, so another place that could be regulated would be at the gas stations. So the gas stations, again, there's not as many gas station companies as there are car drivers, although there are a lot of gas station companies, but you can have regulations at the gas station level. In California, they have a very serious regulation that has to do with the pump handles. They were concerned about gasoline vapors coming out of the pump as you were pumping the gas and going up into the atmosphere and harming you. So they'd design a new kind of pump that surrounds the opening while you're pumping and captures those fumes and recycles it back in, and that's supposed to help keep the air clean. So that would be at the gas stations. Now for the oil companies, we have a very interesting situation because it's like we're talking out of both sides of our mouth. In the one hand, we're giving tax credits to the oil company for exploration to find more oil. So we're encouraging them to find more oil. On the other hand, occasionally we look at the oil companies and we say their profits are too high, and so we end up creating a windfall profit tax, and we say, okay, we're going to tax your profits a higher rate than we are other corporations. So here we're giving you money, and here we're taking money away from you, back and forth, back and forth. Why would the legislators want to do this? What's the economic benefit to them? On the one hand, they're encouraging the finding and production of oil, and then because the cost to produce that oil is lower, they're taking the profits from the oil companies. That means the oil companies have to raise their prices in order to make profits because they're having to pay those higher windfall profit taxes. And so this actually works out very interesting for the consumer because they sort of cancel each other out. But it funds the exploration through the profits from the oil companies. Very interesting. Okay, then there is the consumers. Now consumers, we have the opportunity for a Pigouvian tax by putting a tax on gasoline. Now that would be a Pigouvian tax to the extent that the cars are polluting. So if we put that tax on gasoline, we're creating a Pigouvian tax on the consumer. The more they drive, the more they pay. We're already taxing them to help pay for the roads and their damage to the roads and through the gasoline. Now, what's wrong with gasoline tax? Well, more and more cars now are not using gasoline. They're electric vehicles. So they're basically getting subsidized to use the roads for free because they're not paying anything for the roads. The gasoline cars are paying for the roads, and then the electric cars are using the roads without having to pay for it. As more and more people move to electric cars, it's going to be very difficult to collect any money to maintain the roads. So how do we do that? That's an interesting question. They're talking about putting a device in every vehicle that keeps track of how many miles you drive, and then charging you a tax. You'd have to basically register your credit card with the state, and then they would monitor these devices that have cell phone type capabilities built into them, so they can transfer to the state exactly how much you've been driving on the roads, and then they would charge your credit cards on a monthly basis as part of the cost of driving. So that's one of the things they're considering. Now, another thing that they're very concerned about is congestion, traffic congestion, because when cars are all backed up on the freeway, they're generating way more pollution per mile than they are when the cars are moving at a good pace. So they really don't want the cars to be congested on the freeways or on the roads, because that's much more costly to the environment. So what they want to do is avoid the congestion, and one of the ways they do that is to use metered ramps. So they have these ramps onto the freeway, and they have a red light, green light, and they're all programmed so that electronically they're monitoring the level of traffic, say on the freeway, and if it's available and there's room, then they'll let the cars in a little faster. If it starts to fill up too much, they'll slow down how long it takes for a car to be able to get on the freeway. And that way they can manage it and keep the freeway moving. Of course, the cars on the ramp are backed up and they're producing a lot of fumes. But they did an interesting study where they simulated little bots in a software program driving on freeways. And they had these little bots programmed to act just like people. So, there's an opening there, so I'll change lanes and fill that spot. And some of them were designed to pass others and so forth. And so they had this all programmed. And then they started adding these little automobile bots onto their freeways. And they found that as they did this, it got a little bit more crowded, but the traffic still moved at, 55 miles an hour or 65 miles an hour, whatever. And everything's going along just fine. And then at some point they added one more car and the whole thing stopped. That's it. It just stopped. And then it was all very slow moving traffic from that point on. That one additional car was what it took to break it. And so the idea behind these ramps is to keep that one car from getting on the freeway so the freeway can continue to move. So another question, of course, is this idea of subsidizing the electric and hybrid cars. So they're already getting subsidized because they don't have to pay the tax on the gasoline, which means they're being able to drive on the roads without having to pay for the maintenance of the roads. But then in addition, there's some states that are providing a subsidy if you drive one of these cars. I have a friend, close friend, who's a venture capitalist. He lives one of my neighbors in Los Gatos, but his venture capital office was up in San Francisco. Well, that's about an hour drive each way. And during certain times of the day, it can be not fun because of the traffic. So when he found out about these special privileges associated with electric cars, the subsidy, but also the ability to drive in the carpool lane with only one person in the car, he bought one. He bought one of those cars, and a Prius. And that way he could drive his Prius back and forth to work, and he got to drive in the carpool lane, which he thought was great. Now, he normally drove a $150,000, $180,000 sports car, but that sat parked in his garage. He went back and forth to work because he could drive this thing and not have to drive with the rest of the traffic. Then when they removed that stipulation or that benefit, he parked that Prius and never drove it again and went back to driving his sports car. So the carpool lanes are an interesting phenomenon because the state can use those carpool lanes to reward certain behavior, having more people in the car, having a special kind of car. Interestingly, there's a lot of people who abuse it. I mean, if my wife and I are going up to San Francisco, well, we're going together. We're not going to take two cars. So are we really doing anything special because there's the two of us? No, but we get to drive in the carpool lane anyway. And the whole idea behind the carpool lane was to have people intentionally decide to ride together. But that's not how it's, of course, used. So finally, let's talk about free parking. So employers and businesses subsidize parking to get you to come and shop at their store, to work in their businesses. And the result is, of course, that that cost is then transferred in other ways, but it encourages driving, encourages more people to drive. That, of course, is not the objective. The objective is to have people drive less. So one of the great issues that I have, and a lot of people have, is that we're saying we want to improve the environment, we want to reduce these emissions, but at the same time we're, in some cases, subsidizing the emissions by providing free parking and so forth. Now, in San Francisco, it's not free. A one-day parking in the city is about $50 to $60 for the day. So most people don't drive up to the city. They'll take the train or BART or whatever to get into the city. They'll use the trolleys to get around and so forth. Now, the history of these laws, real quickly. The big one was in 1965, the Clean Air Act, and a whole bunch of other addendums after that. This set the standards for emissions from vehicles. After that, of course, we had certifications. So the manufacturers had to do testing on their cars at different mileage factors and speed. Basically, they had to drive the car in a test environment for 50,000 miles, checking idling, slow, fast, hot and cold engines, and so forth. And then in addition to that, they have random assembly line checks. So they'll come in and randomly pick a car off the assembly line and test it to see. One of the things most of us are aware of is the requirement that the car manufacturers have to put a catalytic converter in the engine. Now, the catalytic converter is a complex device that's connected multiple points in the engine that helps to recycle the carbons and so forth, keep the emissions down. How did we get this technology? Who selected this technology? Is it the best technology? Well, this is a problem, because when we regulate by requiring a specific technology, we eliminate innovation and invention. And so it turns out that the person who invented the catalytic converter had a friend in the Congress, and that friend was able to get it passed that everybody had to use the catalytic converter. His company went from zero into a multi-billion-dollar corporation in a matter of a few years, and then the company was acquired by a major manufacturing company, and that individual became a billionaire. Again, Congress doing its job. But now that the catalytic converter is included in every engine, there's no incentive to come up with a simpler, cheaper way to do it. It's required, it's already there, there's no way you can do it better. So when we're thinking about regulation, we want to think about, could we give these producers a regulation that allows them to innovate? An example of that is the CAFE standards. The government comes into an automobile company and they said, your average mileage per car has to be, say 26 miles per gallon. Now they can make gas guzzlers and they can make small cars that get 60 miles to the gallon, but on the average, they have to get 26 miles per gallon. So if a company starts producing a Hummer, and that's the only thing they produce, they're going to be shut down because the Hummer can't get mileage that's good enough. But one of the big companies that's also producing the Leaf that gets 60 miles or 70 miles per gallon can actually sell Hummers because that will bring their average down. But on the other hand, the CAFE standards do encourage market innovation because the government is saying, here's the standard, 26 miles per gallon. How do you get your cars to that level? That's up to you. Do you make them lighter? Do you make the engines more efficient? Find your way to do it. Whatever's the best way to do it, you accomplish it, it's done. And that sounds like a good market-based idea behind a regulation, setting standards. However, sometimes these things can backfire. So one of the things that we did was we said we're concerned about mileage because mileage affects the pollution. So we want cars to get better mileage and use less fuel. And so we're going to encourage that. Well, the best, most effective way to get better mileage was to make the car lighter. So aluminum bodies, much less supports, make the cars smaller, and the result was more people died because they were now in more fatal accidents because they didn't have the protection of the vehicle. And so there's a trade-off there. We're human life versus cleaner air. And we had to make that decision. So that's something to think about. So we want to think about how do you incentivize the producers? How do you incentivize the distributors? How do you incentivize the consumers? At each different level, where is the best place to tackle this? Where do you get the best incentives for behavior at the least cost? And that's the challenge that you have with mobile air pollution.